Yes, good afternoon and welcome to this second webcast today. I know that some of you participated in this morning's webcast on cloud management. Today it's about FinOps. A short introduction of us. I'm Henrik Zangenberg. I am the CEO of this company, and we do IT and finance. We do benchmarking, we advise on IT economics, and we advise a lot on today's theme, Cloud FinOps. And I am pleased to announce, this morning I announced Kasper, and some people said, did he just start in the company? But actually he didn't. Kasper has been with us for 10 years now.
Yes.
1st of November. But Kasper, introduce yourself.
Thank you. Not exactly a newcomer, but thank you. Yes, my name is Kasper Poulsen, and I'm sort of in charge of our cloud offerings, and have been a major part of sort of building our own product portfolio within these FinOps practice areas that we're going to be discussing today. But also been part of assisting a lot of our clients looking at cloud, both from a strategic point of view, from the FinOps point that we're going to be discussing today, and as part of RFP processes and the likes. So all around within the sort of cloud expertise area has been a key focus for me, especially in the last couple of years.
We've been working with this, as Kasper said, for a number of years. And we publish research on this. So those of you who are subscribers to quarterly analytics will have access to our quarterly cloud report and other research regarding this. And we will, I think, during today's webcast, we will refer to some of the articles and some of the research that you have access to. And we'll also get into stuff that some of you might have seen in earlier webcasts, but we will also give you some of the insights that are fairly new into what really matters when you're looking at your cloud spend and how you can optimize it. This morning we talked about cloud management in general, and this is part of cloud management, but it is, as you also indicated with your poll, an area of focus by many clients. But for those of you who fall asleep, which I don't think that ever happened.
Oh, hopefully not.
But if you should fall asleep during the presentation, we'll give you the key messages here from the outset. So
basically, the first one, cloud cost optimization, is a lot more complex than what you've typically been used to, going basically from standard IT outsourcing or having it on premise. Cost optimization is now as some of these comments also indicates, it's pretty much a new discipline and something that's not sort of easily available within the typical IT resources that you might have. So basically, we are running into a new practice area that you need to bring in some expertise for.
And as we say here, secondly, and if you don't optimize prior and during your cloud journey, and once you're in your to-be state, it will be costly.
Yes.
So not only is it complex, it's also important.
Yes. And I mean, basically, a lot of these FinOps principles and some of the stuff around optimization should not be viewed as a one-off. I mean, a lot of times people go into the cloud and they spend a lot of time sort of cultivating the business case and making sure that is in place and that we optimize before we move to the cloud. That is very important, not to understate that. But you also need to look at it as a continuous practice that needs to be undertaken, at least with some regularity, whether it's daily, weekly, monthly, whatever it might be. You need to look at it continuously. Otherwise, the cost just goes up and you sort of throw away all of the benefits that you might have had prior to moving into the cloud.
Number three is it's extremely important that you not only look at what you're spending today, but try to forecast what you're going to use. So your capacity prognosis is extremely important. And we see this. We've talked about this on several occasions. But when we help client look at their future capacity need, most of them are surprised about what they're looking into, because what the business expects to use in the future will drive a lot more capacity than most IT departments are aware of. And this is due to the increased use of analytics, the increased uptake of IoT. It is the use of cameras, the storage of videos from whatever source. Those kind of new usage, plus AI, machine learning, and stuff like that, really requires a lot of capacity, not really seen by many IT departments. So look and try and forecast with the business your future capacity needs, and make sure that that is actually reflected in your FinOps setup.
And there is going to be a lot of expectation, probably from most of the business units, that these services that you are able to buy in the cloud are the ones that are going to be readily available, because most of the business units will not sit around waiting for the IT sourcing or IT department to buy new hardware, waiting 6 months for that to get delivered and so on. So there is a time to market perspective that is a pretty significant driver for beginning to utilize a lot of these resources.
But the funny thing, it also drives usage. Yes. Because in the past, a department would go to the IT department and ask for some more capacity, and the IT department would say, "Oh yeah, well then we need to go out and buy some more CPUs and a lot more storage," and there would be some kind of a built-in inertia in the system.
Yes.
But it's gone now. The business unit will say, "Hey, we will have another 20 users on the BI platform," and they'll just start using that capacity in the cloud.
Yes.
And this I think is extremely important for IT departments to understand, and it's what tomorrow we actually have the Danish police coming in here for our quarterly event, Kaffe og Tal, coffee and numbers, where they will actually talk about how the police has been surprised by their capacity usage and looking into the future. So this is a theme that's extremely important. Number 4.
Yes, I mean, this is basically alluding a little bit to in the business case that calculate the true cost of moving to the cloud. So make sure when you are looking at the cost of moving to the cloud that you include all of the sort of potential cost elements. So making sure that you optimize on it, but also make sure to include things like data center costs that are not just the VMs, firewall, network, load balance, and so on. The management that is included. So as we talked about in our seminar earlier today, there are still operational tasks that needs to be performed. There is a governance element, there's architectural elements. So all of these are cost elements that should be included when you begin to move into the cloud, utilize a new platform. So these are costs that should be included as well.
And finally,
FinOps, well, basically it's a very important discipline, especially as the cloud cost goes up. And it's typically new to all or many of the organizations, so you don't have any experience in doing this. And that's why we also see a lot of traction on these type of webinars, these type of discussions, because people are sort of looking for learnings and experiences from others as well in trying to sort of establish some good practices around running FinOps.
So, cloud management is more than FinOps.
Yes, so basically this was what we talked about earlier today, that cloud management is sort of a collection of disciplines ranging from governance, the architectural part of it, the operational part of it, and then the FinOps part of it. And today we'll be focusing on the FinOps part. But just to say that there are more to the cloud management than just looking at the FinOps element. But FinOps is a very central discipline. It's something that we spend a lot of time on, and that is just going to increase in importance going forward, because as cloud spend is increasing, well, FinOps is being a more and more central part of it. And we can see from sort of interacting with our clients that FinOps, if you're not already spending a significant time, spend I mean, significant attention on it, you will be forced to do it because the CFO or CIO will look at the cloud spend just ever increasing and maybe sort of challenge you on, well, how long is this going to continue? Can we save some money here somewhere? Because the IT budgets will not be able to sort of handle the growth in cloud spend.
I think over the last 3 months, we've been helping around 10 clients looking at their Azure consumption, and these are clients that we've worked with for several years, and what we see is that the Azure consumption has gone from being in the hundreds of thousands or lower millions to the tens of millions. And now we see clients that click up into the above 100 million Danish kroner kind of consumption patterns, and that basically demonstrates that now it's becoming real. It's becoming CFO worry area. So the lack of predictability that Øyvind mentioned, I think is what really drives a lot of attention in this area.
And also because we've had a lot of clients who have had a lot of focus on speed. So let's make sure that we move a lot of stuff into the cloud, or we have a burning platform or something. And that sort of, you kind of forget the optimization part of it when you have that much focus on speed. And then you have a big task of sort of cleaning up the house afterwards, because we've already moved it into the cloud. And now we are surprised about, well, how expensive it actually was to move it. So that's just what's driving some of the increased attention on it. So basically looking at what we call the cloud spend optimization, there are sort of 3 different pillars that are central to this. Sort of the strategic part of it is that we recommend that you should focus on aligning the business goals at the strategic level. So if speed is the main priority, maybe cost focus is not sort of what you need to keep the biggest eye on. But our sort of takeaway is that at some point, cost will become a strategic criteria as well, because once you are spending your money on the hyperscalers, well, you have less money to spend elsewhere. But making sure that and this also goes back to evaluating what type of options you have, making sure those are aligned with the strategic levels and the strategic goals that you've set up, because that's the only way that you can sort of evaluate the choices being made by the business units against what is the actual cost of having it in the cloud. So if the business is very focused on, well, we need scalability, agility, and so on, that's a different set of options or money you need to spend on it. Compared to if it's just need to be running sort of 24/7 in the cloud instead. So basically making sure that's aligned is very important. Then making sure that you have a detailed business plan and that it's aligned with the stakeholders as well. So making sure there is transparency around the cost, also before moving into the cloud, but also afterwards. So making sure that when the business units approach the IT department or whoever is going to ensure that it's running in the cloud, that you actually make a business plan and say, well, if you want this type of solution, the cost is going to be so and so. Because then afterwards, you are not surprised by the actual cost, and the business units cannot be surprised as well. And making sure that is sort of aligned as well.
And it's also a discussion worth having, whether the business unit is okay with that cost is really closely correlated to activity, and thereby unpredictable if the activity is unpredictable, or whether the business units actually wants predictability in exchange for what? Less flexibility, less scalability. I mean, you can't get it all here.
Exactly.
So it's very much about what the business really wants. And as Kasper says, prioritizations is speed of scalability or flexibility. Is that more important than cost?
Yeah.
Fine. Or predictability and cost.
Yes. And then accountability, which is of course being promoted by having visibility into the cost, making sure that you might implement showback or chargeback as a way of holding the business units accountable for the cloud cost. Luckily, that is easier in the cloud, at least if you follow some principles around asset tagging and so on. But that is actually that makes you able to allocate the cost for workloads specifically to business units, for example, which is something that previously has been a big a sort of difficult task for IT departments. Having large VMware clusters and then finding out how much is allocated to specific allocations is a difficult calculation. But here in the cloud, you can actually allocate it pretty transparently, and that also holds the business units accountable for the spend that they're using. So, yeah.
So that was the strategic kind
Yes.
of the conversation with the business about really what do we want to achieve and,
Yes.
and where does FinOps fit in. Technical is about the technical choices you make.
Yes, making sure that you make the sort of correct choices. So making sure that the type of cloud solutions that you choose are actually aligned to the technical aspect of it. Making sure it's the right fit. Maybe the Yay solution is the best. Maybe it's a PACE. Maybe it's a SAIS solution. But actually doing the evaluation. Making sure what type of workload fits into the different sort of cloud offerings, making sure that you design for cost reduction is a very important part of it. We'll get back to that later as well, but making use of right sizing, using existing licenses, reserved instance, and so on. So that is part of the more technical part of ensuring that you are bringing down the cost as much as possible. And then a very important part is that you need to ensure the workloads are designed for cloud operations, because a large part of the savings that are coming from FinOps or potentially coming from FinOps is being able to automate, script, and move workload around. So one of the major cost levels that we see is, for example, releasing of new versions for servers. You need to be able to shut down the existing server and move it to another server. So you need to be able to move the workload.
Thijs asks if we can elaborate a little on that last part of on the movability.
Yes, I mean, without going into too much of the technical part, because we are not designing the workloads as such, but we see from a typical standpoint in classic IT would be, if the servers are running, we don't shut them down unless it's a service window or something else. So basically you have designed workloads that are not meant to be shut down. It takes a lot of time. Maybe you need to do testing and stuff like that. So having something that's designed for movability is something where you are able to shut it down and bring it back up running without any complications, or at least too many complications. And the reason for that from a FinOps perspective is that you should be able to move it around, because if you are afraid to shut a service down and restart it somewhere else, you will be afraid to sort of execute some of the potential savings that you can get from the FinOps operations.
You could say, if you want to get out on the extreme where you can optimize the most, this is what the application should be able to. It should be designed for movability. If it's not, then you have less room for optimization, basically.
Yes, exactly.
The last one is on the operational part.
Yeah, so the operational part, making sure that you develop and integrate FinOps capabilities. That's what we are talking about today as well, and making sure that it's implemented into the organization. And that's a lot of the questions or answers that we got here earlier was centered around that as well. So we'll get back to that later, but it's a very important how you implement the actual FinOps role into the organization, because we see a lot of clients where the FinOps role is basically designated within the finance department, and it's all about visibility and maybe some show back, but there is no actual sort of cost optimization being performed in the organization. So finding a way to implement that and making sure that the FinOps competencies and capabilities are an integrated part of the process when you are designing or building new workloads into the cloud is a very central part of it, at least to gain the optimal of the sort of FinOps role.
The last one I have here is, how do customers approach the agenda of securing accountability in the IT spend? And I think we'll get back to that by the end of this presentation.
Yes.
When we get back to showback and chargeback, and because that is really the way you do that.
Where should FinOps be placed? I think that is situational, but typically where we see the best effect, if you have a cloud COE, a center of excellence somewhere where you are able to gather some of these resources, because FinOps cannot exist just on itself in the finance department, for example. That will never be sort of optimal. You need to have some cross-sectional, cross-functional capabilities that work typically we see it, for example, in the cloud COE or somewhere where you are able to draw upon the competencies of engineers and cloud architects as well. Because
and it goes both ways, doesn't it? Because
Yeah.
you need close access to people with technical skills to actually identify the optimization levers on one hand, and secondly, if you want to, as one of you asked, how do you ensure that it actually happens? You need to have a close link, and I think that's in many times that's best achieved through organizational proximity. You need to have a close link to those who are actually going to execute the optimization initiatives. So that talks to basically putting people together in a cloud center of excellence, and often we'll see that within the IT department.
And I think to the first question around how do you ensure that business units are actually utilizing the sort of the cost savings that you identify, that's a very difficult part. And I think maybe sort of the optimization potential can be split into different type of recommendations. So some of it, IT basically should have the mandate to actually effectuate that. So reserved instance, for example, there should be no discussions around whether we should use this or not. That should just be done. But when you're looking into some of the more advanced options of, well, can we convert this type of workload into a paid solution, or can we do something that is sort of significantly changing it? Of course, you need to sort of present that to the business units, but you have no way of actually sort of forcing that through. That should always be the business unit's decision. What you typically do is you make sure that the sort of financial responsibility resides within the business units, and then they'll have to make that decision on their own.
Right now, what we're talking about is what we see around, across our clients and what seems to work. But I think the most important thing here is that you actually make a deliberate choice, and this resides within what we talked about earlier. This is governance, right? So without a clear governance, where responsibilities have been placed, without any doubt, this is where we have to make these decisions regarding optimization and how we are going to do it, and what are the guardrails that basically tells us what you can and cannot do. It will seldom work well. So governance is a central part of this.
And I mean that we elaborated a bit on this in our previous presentation as well, but that is also one of the reasons why a lot of organizations struggle with this type of sort of implementation, because once the business units, maybe they've been used to buying all type of different cloud services for the past 2 or 3 years, and now we're trying to implement governance, now we're trying to implement FinOps. That is sort of trying to rein back the spend and trying to bring back some control from a central perspective. And that's where you really need to approach it as an advisory role, where you try to help the business units by sort of optimizing the cost, rather than trying to put sort of the brakes on it.
I think we'll move on. Or did we get through the operation?
Almost. I think just the last two, continuous monitoring. So it's basically following up all the time, not just before we move into the cloud. And the last one, implement transparency and chargeback. It's a big part of it, making sure that you are actually able to see who's spending what on which resources in the cloud. And then optionally, showback or chargeback can be a big incentive driver as well. And we'll get back to it later, but that can be a big part of it as well.
And I think the square root of this is you need people that actually gets up in the morning and go to work and do this.
Yes. And I think the second part is it is not a standalone function that just sort of resides by itself in the basement somewhere. You need to have a view on it as being strategic and being both technical and operational.
And now you have your head just below the problem area, Kasper. So
yeah, so basically this is an example. We've shown it a couple of times, but developers integrating new functions into an existing workload, existing application. And of course, for the developer, they've seen new functions released in Amazon or Azure for that matter. But the problem is, once you implement this, it has a very significant impact on the cost of the workload we're running. So an increase almost from day to day with 170%. I mean, you have to have a very convincing argument of the functionalities you're implementing that can actually sort of justify a cost increase like that. And this is not sort of a standalone example. We've seen this many times. And because some of these functions are something that maybe it improves the performance of the application by caching a lot of data or something else, storing a lot of extra data. And that's just a significant cost driver. So you have to sit down and evaluate and challenge the business or developers, whoever made the implementation, and say, well, I mean, unless we can double or triple the price for whatever product we're selling, this is not something that we can accept.
And the interesting thing here is, of course, that the developers will not see this unless someone tells them that hey, cost has gone up.
And I mean, in the best world, this is a very reactive approach to FinOps. So now we see the cost increase. Now we have to rein it back. And as you can see, that the cost is not going back as quickly as well. The best case scenario would be that before implementing this, you run it by a FinOps team, you run it by the Cloud Center of Excellence and say, well, we're looking at this new functionality. What will the cost be? So you can actually model and you can predict or calculate what will the impact be. And then you're able to make an informed decision beforehand instead of trying to sort of clean up afterwards. So that's, again, back to the maturity levels. Once you move up in maturity level, you should not see spikes like this. You should be able to predict them or prevent them.
So what is FinOps, Kasper?
So basically, this slide is showing some of the main areas that we should look at as being part of the FinOps practices. So waste management is basically cleaning up, making sure that you don't have underutilized or never utilized resources, both from VM, storage, so forth.
How big of a problem is this?
A big problem. I think we get a lot of data from customers or clients, Azure spend, AWS spend, and so on. And this is always a significant part where we have not, or the client have not decommissioned resources not being used. If you can couple this with utilization data, you can also see that a lot of it is inactive and not being used. So this
was a problem when you had your data center in the basement.
Yes.
You had a lot of capacity unused, but it's still a problem.
Yeah, and the problem has changed because you used to have sort of a baseline when you went out and bought new hardware. And once it was bought, you had the write-offs or the depreciations, and that wouldn't change much. So basically, once we bought it, well, it doesn't matter. Of course, there could be some license cost and so on, but it isn't as big a problem when you already invested in the hardware. But now, when you're running in the cloud, you are paying by the hour. So basically, this is money out the window. Every minute, every second, this is running. So,
and when we talk about it right now, it is of course because it's important, and because the sheer numbers here are interesting. So it's not like cloud waste management will give you 3 or 4 or 5% in savings. It potentially, we are talking about 20 or 30 or 40% of savings if you're not aware, if you're not really analyzing on your actual spend here. Cloud is the promise of only paying for what you use, but you need to shut down the stuff you're not using. Yes. It doesn't shut down itself. So that is an extremely important point here, is that cloud waste management is where a lot of money is actually waiting for you to be saved. Wouldn't it be better to move cost accountability to the development teams, is Thijs asking. Yeah, well.
Yes, I think typically what happens is the development teams are very focused on developing solutions to problems, functionality, so forth. So they have limited time and resources to spend on actually gathering and learning stuff about the FinOps capabilities. And I think that's the main issue. In the best of all worlds, yes, they would be very focused and conscious about this. But I think just in the essence of sort of focusing people's attention on the right things, we see it. The best case would be having a specialist within this type of area working closely together with the developers to make sure that they have focus on developing, and then they can refer to the FinOps guys or teams for expert advice on cost optimization.
And also the developers, will impact some of the cost by making bad code, as we saw before, or unconsciously using functions that drives a lot of capacity need. But some of these disciplines that we're describing now are not really well suited for the developers for them to actually spend time on looking at the utilization over time, the utilization patterns over time. Perhaps that's not the best way to use your scarce resources of developers. So yeah, some of the accountability at the developers, but some of it definitely outside.
And I think, again, talking about the maturity levels, once you move up in maturity level, it will be easier and better to also align business KPIs and other stuff against the cloud cost. So they will have full transparency on, well, we're developing this type of new solution. The cost in the cloud will be so-and-so, and we are expecting a return of investment of so-and-so. And then you can actually evaluate whether or not we are making some good decisions. But all of that requires a level of maturity that we don't see too many clients being at yet, at least.
Surajit says that one of the solutions could be to basically break this down to what he calls product teams. So a product-based operating model, which I guess in some cases will make a lot of sense. It actually requires that you have that kind of a product focus on what you are doing.
I think also an important comment here is to say that when you're looking at business units and developers in DevOps teams and so on, they're only part of the business. And looking at FinOps, you should also take the perspective that there is a lot of optimization in doing things across the entire enterprise. So not only optimizing within the individual developer teams, but also optimizing across all of your cloud consumption. So basically there are optimization within having pooled resources together, making sure that you are utilizing resources that you bought in other areas, utilizing workloads in sort of a more cross-functional way. So that's also where FinOps becomes a more sort of cross-functional and central discipline instead of only residing within the individual developer teams. So that's just another sort of way of utilizing some of the potential is looking at it from a more sort of enterprise-wide perspective.
But again, I think our answer to a lot of your questions here will be, yes, it's important that you find a model that works within your organizational and strategic setup. And I think all of what you have mentioned will make sense in a lot of situations. But be aware that we don't believe there's a one-size-fits-all or one model or one governance structure that fits all. It is really about making this work within the organization. But what we're describing right now, the disciplines, the cloud waste management, design for cost reduction, the dynamic optimization, and the evaluation of platform options, those are disciplines that you need to make sure works no matter what the governance setup is. So you need to find a place where someone is actually actively doing this. And let's take the next one, Kasper.
Yeah, dynamic optimization is a little bit more of trying to do the constant or continuously cost optimization with regards to sizing, with regards to shutting down stuff that's not running. Could be disaster recovery options, all of that's sort of ongoing and a little bit more dynamic in nature, which again, you need to have workloads where you can actually do this type of stuff. So shutting down it's potentially best if you are sure that you can run it again or put it back to use. And the same with sizing, making sure that you can actually size it and sort of size down and scale up if necessary. So the dynamic part of it is the ongoing part and something where the business needs to be involved as well. Design for the cost reduction, we've sort of talked a little bit about it as well, but making sure that when you're designing it, you have a set of criteria that are focused around how can we optimize for cost before we actually put it into production or into use. So that can be anything from making sure that you're basically right-sizing so we are not over-provisioning resources before we even get to start using the resources. So start as small as possible and then scale up. use reserved instance if possible. Maybe you already have committed something in reserved instance, so basically you have free resources somewhere in the enterprise that you can use. Otherwise, making sure that you actually use it for workloads where it sort of makes sense. It can be regions where you look at, well, if it's a lot cheaper in Germany West or somewhere else, it could be something like that. And then again, looking at Yates, Pays, and Says as different types of ways of solving your problem. Yates can be one approach, but maybe a managed database is a better option than actually installing your own SQL on a VM. So evaluating those type of options and making sure that you've taken cost into consideration.
So this is also where getting the landing zone for your first move into the cloud, getting that right,
yes,
is really important. And I think we've seen a lot of basically rough first shots at defining a landing zone, and we believe it makes sense to actually right-sizing it from the outset.
Yeah, I mean, basically all of the clients that we've engaged with or done some of the cloud business cases, typically you have the existing cost for running on-premise or with an outsourcing vendor. And to even get near that cost or potentially below that cost, you have to use basically all of the tools available to lower your cost in the cloud. So you have to use reserved instance, you have to use existing licenses, you have to right size all of that stuff to even be competitive with the existing pricing. And that's just to say, not doing this type of stuff will almost guarantee that it's more expensive to run it in the cloud than it is running it on-premise or whatever setup you have today.
We actually, in quarterly, there's a cloud report every quarter where you can actually see what a one-to-one move of five or six capacity patterns, what that will cost if you just move them one-to-one. And in most cases, it will become significantly more expensive. Moving into the cloud. So you need to, I mean, if you just move into the cloud without doing anything, it will most certainly become more expensive.
And typically what you are faced with is Microsoft, Azure, AWS, Google. They will present a cost for running a type of workload and then say, if you can use reserved instance, you will save 50 or 60%. And that's right. But what they're maybe not telling you is if you don't use that option, you are, saving the 50 or 60% makes it competitive. If you're not doing that, it's not competitive. So you need to use some of these levels to be able to have attractive pricing. I think basically the platform options here, making sure that you compare existing on-premise solutions, compare the cloud vendors against each other, and making sure that you sort of look at what type of exit options could be in place if we need to use them. So I think those are sort of the main areas within FinOps that we have a lot of focus on, at least.
And Jan is asking a question whether our private cloud versus on-prem calculations are based on if that's with or without optimization reservation. It's without.
It's without.
So it shows the one-to-one, and it basically shows that you, in order for this to be competitive, you need to do something. And what that something is basically up to you in the actual situation to decide. Or that is a special analysis, you could say. So that's what the analysis shows. Yes.
So just some examples here of the waste management: unmanaged assets, oversized instances, unattached storage, on-demand pricing, old snapshots, environments that are always on, provisioned IOPS, and sort of the architectural sort of decisions that increases cost. So these are some of the examples where you need to step in and make sure that you are cleaning up and not just overpaying for basically something that doesn't provide any business value or value at all. Basically cleaning your room and making sure that costs are kept under control.
And what you have here is basically the description of what the FinOps people should be looking for. So basically they should be sweeping the entire spend for unmanaged assets, and they should be looking for oversized instances. They should be looking for unattached storage. And for each and every one of these waste types, there's an analysis you can perform. And there's a cleanup action you can take.
And again, going back to the maturity, once you reach a level of maturity, maybe you don't need to have someone manually doing this. You're able to set it out automatically and say, well, if the storage hasn't been accessed in 30 days or the VM hasn't been actually active in 30 days or 60 days, we are going to automatically just decommission it. And then maybe we'll send a notice 5 days in advance to the business units that has been tagged, and then we're shutting it down.
And so, this is a new way of working.
Yes.
And it's not without risk.
No.
So just saying that this requires, this is going back to the governance part of it. This requires that everybody agrees that this is the way we do it now, because otherwise we'll spend a hell of a lot too much money on our cloud consumption. But you can also, every one of these tasks could be something that you would actively analyze.
Yes.
Say once a month, whether we have stuff we need to tidy up.
Yes. And basically going back to sort of the recurring task here, you will typically be faced with some sort of consideration on how often or how much should we be doing this type of these activities. It could be that you set up sort of a yearly wheel where you run something on a weekly basis, something on a monthly basis, and something annually. It could be that some of this spending and reporting is a weekly task where you're able to track it along and see whether or not we are within budget, or something that moves the budget significantly. Especially warnings for the CIO, the CFO, making sure that we are on track for the budget is sort of something that a lot of organizations use.
Can I stop you a little?
Yes.
Because I think even the fact that you have a budget in itself
exactly.
I think is a point. Do you have a budget?
Yes.
Do you have a cloud budget? So what do you actually track your consumption against? And we believe, yes, you should have a budget. You should have a budget that was made based on the assumption of a certain activity in the business, translated into a capacity need, and then translated into a budget for the cloud consumption. And once you're outside your budget bracket, it's probably going to be a bracket. But once you're outside it, and you should track that, we believe every week at least, you should be looking for the reason. The reason could be, hey, they're just using, they have more users on the BI platform, so that's why we spend more. And you could go back and say, hey, you're using more of the BI platform, are you willing to pay more for it? Or however, whoever is going to pay for that.
Yeah.
But it could also be, we are not optimizing the platform the right way. So it's basically more within the IT to make sure that we are on budget.
Yeah, and also just to prevent the type of scenarios that we saw in the previous slides, that cost has increased 3 or 4-fold or something. Getting the tracking in place so you're able to react much sooner rather than later is very important. Getting back to sort of the recurring tasks here, monthly task, and again, it could be weekly as well. Once you move up in spend, I think these becomes something that you will sort of approach with a higher frequency. But the waste management that we just elaborated on previous slides, and the optimization options with regards to, well, have we utilized the reserved instance, hybrid use benefits, etc. Something that could be formalized in a report or something along those lines. So having that as sort of something that you do on a regular basis, and not just something you do once a year or once before you move it to the cloud and then not again. So that's why we sort of put emphasis on having these as recurring tasks and not just something you do as a one-off.
Exactly. So yeah, it's a job.
Yeah, basically. And just drawing on some data from the FinOps Foundation, which they do a questionnaire on some of the clients that they have, or at least the participants in the questionnaires, on how often you update your cloud forecast budgets. And as we can see from this and from your answers as well, some do it weekly, but it's not a big percentage. Some do it quarterly, some do it monthly, and then some do it annually. So Basically, it's mostly typical to do it. I mean, quarterly and annually together is more than 50%. So, I mean, that's not a very high frequency for looking at these type of costs. If you haven't looked at or budgeted against your cloud spending for 3 to 4 months, you could be in for a surprise. So basically, this is very common to not visit those budget forecasts with some regularity, but we also see that again, this is mostly due or I mean part of the maturity journey that most clients are on. That this is becoming a sort of task that is reoccurring with a higher frequency.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I mean, basically, when we're looking at the FinOps, there are also different ways to approach sort of the where can we optimize part of it. So there's basically, are we buying the right services? So what are the options for switching from gas to PaaS or changing storage technology or something along those lines? There can be a lot of savings to be had in that. We've had clients where we examined their cloud spend, and we saw that backup was the single largest cost element in the Azure consumption, and that was because the client had chosen to use sort of geo-redundant backup storage, and the obvious question was, well, why why have you chosen that? Is that a conscious decision? And it wasn't. It was basically, well, it would be nice to have, so let's just click it on and let's have that as the standard. So basically, they were able to optimize, I think, maybe a 20 or 30% cost decrease by actually just taking a decision of saying, we don't need that. I mean, basically, we can live with having our backup in a non-geo-redundant setup, so it doesn't need to be spread out across different geographical regions. So that's sort of right in front of you, and you just need to examine the options and making sure that you have chosen also with the economics as part of the scope. And then the optimization is sort of, are we buying the lowest version of the servers, the newest version of the servers? Are we buying the newest version of the app plans, of all of the other options that are available? So that is keeping an eye on constantly optimizing the services that we're buying. And then, of course, there are internal or third-party services that could also be benchmarked. So making sure that discount rates we're getting from Azure or AWS are in line with market standards or market levels. If we have a cloud management provider that are providing services on top, making sure that they have pricing that are in line with market prices and so on. So that's another perspective that could be part of making sure that we have cloud costs under control.
The last one can be a very important one. I mean, just looking at the discount rate you have on your Azure prices, I mean, compared to list price,
yes,
is of course a huge contributor to the total saving, and also, yeah, the external parties helping you. What do you pay them? So yeah.
Yes, and just, I mean, this is just to show that this is a picture that we're seeing from a lot of clients now, is that they have significant increase in the cloud spend, and it also varies a lot just from day to day. So it's not just a smooth increasing line. There are a lot of variability and spikes within or sort of tracking over the years, and this is very typical spend picture from a lot of our clients.
So this is what they actually built.
Yes.
So and of course, there's below that there's a actually utilization pattern as well.
Yes.
Showing what they use, but now we're just looking at what they actually spent.
Yes. This is basically just looking at the consumption patterns and looking at, well, what are causing the spikes, what are causing the increases, and so on. So this is just a very high level, but this is something that you would track against potentially a budget where you have maybe we have a set goal of maybe we wanted to, or we expected to increase by 20% per year or 30% based on hopefully, in best case, maybe a strategy or roadmap or something that outlines why our cloud spend is increasing, not just due to just workloads increasing without any sort of strategy behind it. So,
and there might be a very good reason why it increased by 41%.
Exactly.
I mean, there might be a lot of business value that came from that increase.
Yes.
But we don't know before we've actually looked into it.
No, exactly. And part of the complexity that we've highlighted from sort of the FinOps area here is that for Azure, AWS, these are just the samples here, the number of services are ever increasing. So this is just a breakdown of the number of unique server types, unique VMs that you can choose from. So the service catalog within just one area, where you have a 60 or 70% increase in the number of options available to you. So that's why, going back to the discussion around who should sort of be the expert, who should be able to guide you on this, someone needs to dedicate some time to actually gather this information, be on top of it, and make sure that you are actually tracking and following along on this. We have our own tools here in the company for tracking the different server types and tracking the prices overall, so making sure that we can actually keep up with the development here. But this is a picture that is basically all over the service catalog from the cloud providers, that they are sort of ever expanding the number of products and features that they are bringing to the customers.
And you need to, I mean, the reason why it's important is not just that these are smart new things, it's also because the only way to get cheaper servers is to buy newer servers, right?
Yes, exactly.
I mean, so keeping up with this is a necessity to actually keep up with the decline in prices.
Yeah, I mean, coming from old school, or at least a classic IT infrastructure contract where you might have a built-in price decrease, or you have options for decreasing the price in the contract period. So maybe you have efficiency gains of 5% on the servers, so on the storage. You automatically get that sort of discount and efficiency gain, but typically in the cloud, you will get none of that. You will pay the same price that you paid 10 years earlier. The only reduction in price is when you move from an older version to a newer version and actually utilize that, Moore's law and so on, that the prices for the capacity are falling. That's only being introduced with newer workloads or newer servers. So basically, you have to move it from a version 4 to a version 5, and then you will get a 30% decrease in the price, or alternatively, you will get a 30% increase in the capacity you're getting for the same price. But those are basically the numbers we're talking about here. So, for example, you have all of your workloads running on D series in a version 1 or version 2. If you're able to move that to the newer version, you just reduced your cloud consumption cost with 30 or 40%.
And if you don't, what you will see is that your price will flatline, your unit price will flatline, but your consumption will increase, as it's done since, the very early days of IT. Our consumption of gigabytes and CPUs have just increased and increased and increased. It will continue to do that. So if you don't get the decrease in unit price, your cost picture will explode. As we have seen with those clients with classical outsourcing contracts without price adjustments, that suddenly we're in a place where they could basically cut their outsourcing contract down with 70 or 80% because the unit price had flatlined for a long number of years. You will see the same here if you don't utilize those new versions.
And we have a comment regarding that sometimes you move into something where the performance is actually worse on the newer ones, and that is true. So you need to be very, or you need to examine, again, just going back to the complexity in this, you need to examine when they release a new version, for example. Is it the same CPU type? Is it worse? How do they approach the over-provisioning, all that type of stuff? So basically, you just need to gather the info and make sure that you are taking an informed decision on whether we choose to upgrade to a newer version. Some of them we've seen were basically just cost savings. Others, as mentioned here, you are actually getting a decrease in performance. And that, of course, you need to be very conscious about if you're doing that.
There's a really good drill down question. Is that one you were referring to? Yeah. Okay, good.
And just to say, I don't think we have any recommendations on sort of the benchmark for the technical part of it, but I know there are resources available where they do, they examine CPU clock frequencies and all that type of stuff. So yes, you should do that part of the homework as well. It's not only a cost exercise when you're looking at newer versions, etc. You need to take into consideration the performance as well.
Obviously, yeah. But the overall picture is that if you stay on the same version long enough, it will be more expensive than switching to newer versions, but there might be variations in performance and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yes. I think we are a little bit short on time, but this is going back to some of the earlier questions that you had. Again, taking from the FinOps Foundation here, where they made a questionnaire regarding FinOps challenges, and I think you will recognize a lot of the answers that you gave here as being some of the top ones as well. So I think it's quite interesting to see that the number one challenge, 30 against 29%, but still 30%, that is getting engineers to take action on cost optimization. And we see this, with a lot of our clients, that you can have all of the good options available. You can have a full catalog of cost reduction options, but actually getting engineers, architects, business units to actually implement the changes is something that is typically very difficult. So that goes back to the whole governance part, making sure that it is implemented and making sure that it is actually part of the process to take action on these type of things. And again, this is something that should be customized to individual organizations, but it's just to say this is a very central issue for a lot of these, for FinOps in a lot of organizations. It's not unique and something that we encounter a lot as well. And I think 29% here said accurate forecasting of spend goes back to exactly what we discussed before. This is a very common issue as well. And of course, all of these variations and fluctuations, volatility in cloud spend is of course affecting this. And the third one here is organizational adaptation of FinOps. So basically 1 and 3 here in top 3 are centered around the governance part of how we actually implement this stuff. So I think that's a sort of a key takeaway, that you really need to take into account them when you're building these FinOps practices and when you're trying to establish them. You need to have a lot of focus on how do we actually implement this into the organization. That's a key component and at least an area that is a big challenge to almost everyone when looking at this stuff. And then the list goes on here about enabling automation, reducing waste and unused resources. So a lot of these are basically the same themes that we've been discussing here all along, but it's the common problems for almost everyone.
Anne is just asking in the chat if the FinOps practitioner certification is worth the time. I haven't seen it before. It's something we'll definitely look into. So
yeah, I know the sort of certification, but I haven't been through it myself. So I don't think I should comment too much on whether it's
worth the $300
time or not.
But a good question. And if any of you have any experiences on that, please share with the rest of us. We haven't at this point. So.
Yeah, I think without spending too much time on it, just to say, typically you'll end up in a hybrid setup here. It will take a long time for mostly all of the sort of enterprise clients to move into a fully cloud setup, if that ever happens. There are still workloads that are perfectly fine suited for running on-premise and not being part of the cloud. But of course, this increases the complexity of also the FinOps practices, because you need to establish an overview and cost and show back, not only for the cloud spending, but you also have the on-premise spending if you need to be able to compare the cost of these different types of working environments. So basically having a full transparency around the cost, both on your on-premise and in the cloud, is something that requires quite a lot of both knowledge, data, and pricing insights to actually be able to make those comparisons. And of course, this moving workloads to the cloud will increase the on-premise cost, typically because the marginal cost of running the data center will go up when you move workloads out of the data center. So it typically gets more expensive to keep your old data center running when some of your workloads move into the cloud. And this aspect about recoding applications is typically very expensive. So typically you will have a lot of stuff left in your on-premise data center because all of the old applications you have there is no business case in trying to recode them or try to make them fit into a cloud world. So basically all of this ties into FinOps possibly also extending beyond the cloud and making sure that you include some of the options for the on-premise data center, or the alternative at least, so you are actually able to compare against not only cloud pricing, but also private cloud or on-premise pricing. And again, advertising a little bit for our own products here, we make some of these comparisons ourselves. And of course, it's just very important that when you make these comparisons, you try to include all of the stuff that is basically included in the on-premise solution and in the cloud solution, just to get full transparency on the cost comparison. Yes, I think we'll jump ahead here. So one of the issues that that you are faced with when moving to the cloud, at least, is sort of invoicing that there is a lot of complexity in what do these services actually cost. So you used to be able to buy a server from your outsourcing provider, and it was one line item, and it was running one VM, and that included cross-functional, it included data center operations, it included server operations, it included the hardware, the software, all of that. But when you're looking in the cloud, you're basically trying to piece together the same invoicing line using 10 different services. So basically you will have some virtual data center cost that is spread across 15 different services, load balancers, data in, data out, etc. You will have licenses that are potentially coming from a different contract. You have an existing Microsoft contract. You have the capacity, you have management, which could be provided internally or it could be provided externally. And all of that basically goes together in trying to establish the same baseline for the same service that you previously had maybe one line for. So the complexity of buying cloud services is also tied to getting a good overview on how do all of these different line items, all of this massive service catalog, number of services, how do that actually match up against the services that we were used to buying? And also getting just transparency on the true cost of the services. So making sure that all of these are included. And of course, asset tagging and making sure that you assign all of this to the correct business units or the correct applications goes a long way. But you will still have the cross-functional part of it. You will still have services that are outside the scope of the hyperscaler, for example, the cloud management part, that you need to include to establish sort of a full overview of the true cost of the services. So basically putting all of the building blocks together and making sure that you have a complete and full overview of the cost is a time-consuming and an exercise that needs to be done, but is quite difficult because you now have so much complexity in the pricing of the services that you typically wasn't used to in an outsourcing contract, for example. And going back to the maturity journey here that we've talked about a couple of times now, this is sort of typical where we see clients sort of move. You go from transparency, which is basically the first step. We need to establish overview of the cost. We need to make sure that we can see the tracking of the spending. We need to align maybe with the budget and with forecasting. But we're not really doing anything. We're just tracking, we're having transparency, and we can maybe show the business how much we're spending on cloud. The next step in that process is typically going to the optimization part of it. So actually doing a lot of the stuff we talked about with the waste management, with the optimization levels, making sure that we are actually doing that type of stuff. And I would even split optimization into something where you just do some recommendations and something where you're actually doing some of the optimization. But basically, this is where you provide support for the business units on how to rein in cloud costs to optimize the cloud spending. And then there is sort of the big step that Henrik also alluded to, is going from optimization to automation is a very big step. We don't see too many clients being there yet because this is a change of the way you're doing things, where you are not just now proposing optimization levels, you're actually building it into an automated process where it could be policies around decommissioning stuff that you haven't used for a while. It could be automatically sizing down stuff that you aren't fully utilizing. Test development, if it's already tagged as that, maybe we are closing it down for the night. There could be all type of different options here. But this is moving to automation, where of course the business case is that much bigger because you don't need to spend time on actually effectuating it, and it's just built in as part of your FinOps processes.
But it's also comes with a certain amount of risk.
Yes, and it's a shift of paradigm typically for most of our clients, because that's something they haven't been used to, that this is basically automated. And then the last step is basically business integration, where you begin to connect these FinOps stuff to actual business KPIs, for example, and you're able to fully track, this application gave us this much of a return compared to what it cost in the cloud and so on. So that's sort of a level where we typically don't see any clients at yet, but that will be sort of the next, the final step on the maturity journey here.
But starting the conversation with the business is basically part of the two first steps.
Yes.
And making sure that you set expectations and you actually try to deliver according to the expectations of your business units.
And just to link it to just go one back to the FinOps Foundation, they have this crawl, run, walk, or crawl, walk, run, which is basically the same part of as a maturity journey, making sure that these type of actions are basically linked to the transparency, optimization, and automation. So just to show sort of the data here from their questionnaire around where do clients see themselves in sort of rating their own maturity, we can see that basically the pre-crawl, where you are not even providing the transparency yet, and the crawl, that is actually a majority of the answers in the questionnaire, and then you have a lot in the walk area, and a minority in the run area, which is sort of the most mature. And you can see some of the sort of the KPIs you can use for self-evaluation in the far right in the table. And basically, some of that is how much are we actually tracking? Do we have full asset tagging on all of our resources in the cloud? How much do we deviate from the budget at any given point, and so forth? So here is some criteria that you can use to evaluate, but this aligns pretty well with what we see from our clients, that a large part of them are still in the very basic part of the maturity journey, and some of them have moved into sort of the optimization part of it, and very few are in the automation and sort of the advanced end of the optimization part. Yes, and basically looking at typical FinOps team, going back to the discussion we had earlier as well, that typically it needs to be some sort of cross-functional cloud COE, where you have both the FinOps capabilities, you have cloud architects, you have engineers that are able to interact and basically making sure that we are using the right services aligned with the cloud strategy. The engineers can effectuate the optimizations that we're looking at, and the FinOps guys can look at the consumption and see where the potential is at, and they can guide and sort of advise the business on how to optimally use the cloud cost. So basically, this is a very important part of implementing this, is to make sure that you don't just have FinOps as a separate silo that is working totally independent of these functions as well. And as we said a couple of times, a cloud COE is typically where we see it reside. And then, of course, there's a lot of differences between the cloud COEs and what type of mandate do they have. But this is the typical way of doing it, and sort of the most optimal way of implementing the FinOps capabilities.
And the business case here about having these 5 people, as we have in this example, is really to say, okay, what would be the extra cost if we didn't have these 5 people? And if you are looking at a cloud spend of 2 million Danish kroner a year, obviously that's difficult to find the business case here. But if you're spending like 20 million a year on cloud, or perhaps even 50 million a year, well, the extra cost of not having these people will be extraordinarily much bigger than the salary of these 5 people.
I mean, just to put some numbers on it, I think we've seen a lot of clients cost or Azure spend or AWS spend, and of course there's a bias that when they call us, typically they are looking for some guidance for this. But we haven't seen a single instance where we haven't been able to find 20% on the cloud spend just by doing the sort of cost reduction part of it, and then you can put on top of that all of the optimization that you can do afterwards as well. So basically, if you are spending 10 million, 20 millions, we would be very surprised if you haven't done any of this stuff if we weren't able to find at least 20% and potentially a lot more than that. So those are the type of numbers we're looking at when we are sort of talking about the FinOps capabilities here.
I think, there's 4 levers to reduce cost, and those are basically tied to, we've talked about right sizing, making sure that you only have the footprint you need at any given time. Reserved capacity, reserved instances.
Yeah, it has a little bit of different name, whether you're going with AWS or Azure or whatever, but basically it's an upfront commitment and then you're getting a big discount. And of course, I mean, it's no surprise that the way that they are able to give you this discount is because prices on hardware is decreasing over time. So basically you're committing for 1 or 3 years and then you'll get a discount. And it's sort of a necessary cost level that you need to implement if you want to reduce your spend. But there are a lot of ways to actually implement this. You could be it can be in a very fluid way where you are using it across the entire organization, or it can be to specific workloads. But you need to implement this, and there are a lot of ways. We have a separate article in QA where we go more into depth around these sort of levels. But basically, all of these 4 needs to be implemented to make sure that you are running at a sort of cost-efficient level. And I think just to give you some examples for some of these, I mean, this is just looking at regions. There could be potentially a 40% decrease. Again, there are considerations around where do we have express routes, where do we have the data center, but these are the type of savings that can be had just by looking at the regions. It can be even more than that, but there are typically a lot of differences between these different regions. So there are a lot of strategic sort of criteria that probably supersedes the choice of region, but still, looking from a cost perspective, there can be significant options here. And just to sort of give an example from a client here on what are the options here, what can we do? So looking at this client's portfolio, sort of having a lot of B servers running that weren't using reserved instance, you could do that and you could potentially save maybe somewhere around $1 million or a little bit less a year just by implementing that. So you are making the upfront commitment and then you're getting the savings on the discount. There are version upgrades, there are prepaid for the stamp fees. So this is just a catalog of potential FinOps optimization levels that you can implement. So these are something where you are not typically rewriting anything, you're not doing anything other than utilizing the levers that are available to you in the cloud. So this is where we are talking about the at least 20% cost reduction when looking at this. And this, of course, needs to be then implemented as a continuous sort of task where you look at all of the spend and see, well, where can we potentially do something here to reduce the cost? Yeah. I think let's go over that one. Yeah, basically it's a little bit about the licenses. I think, well, maybe just to say that licenses can be a very significant part of the total business case when looking in the cloud. So looking at some of the SQL servers in Azure, the license cost can be upwards of 80% of the total cost if you're choosing to buy those through Microsoft. So when you're looking at FinOps, I mean, it's tempting to look at just the capacity and looking at what type of options do we have available here. But ideally, you should very much have a focus on the licensing part of it as well. How can we optimize that? How can we build a total business case where we take the licenses into consideration as well? Because if you don't do that, you could be over provisioning CPUs and then you have to pay licenses for that. So there are some pitfalls where you need to make sure that the license part of it is a central part of the calculations as well. So that's basically sort of the insights from that. And the same goes to the paid services. I mean, typically it's not cheaper in sort of a consumption way to buy it as a paid service. But what you might get is that you are removing some of the internal tasks that you should be doing otherwise. So patching, doing the backup and so forth. If I'm buying a managed database, maybe I'm able to remove some of those. What you then, on the other hand, should be very cautious about is that some of these paid options maybe is a bad fit for the sort of CPU to memory scaling that you have internally, and that is impacted by the licenses that you need to buy. So making sure that that is taken into consideration when you're looking at, for example, paid services is very important. So we've seen some business cases where basically the business cases, we can move it to a paid solution, then we'd save a lot of money. That could be the case, but you really, really need to make sure that the license cost is included as well, because otherwise you could end up with a significant higher cost by moving into that area, because you can't do the same sort of customization of the servers as you could maybe internally. And just to give you an example here of a client, making sure that we are using all of the levers here, it's also quite obvious that some of the levers are a lot more efficient than others. So moving from no optimization to utilizing 3-year reserved instance is a cost reduction maybe of around 100 million per year. So that is a big part of it. And making sure that you use the licenses correctly is a very significant part of it as well. Going from 88 million to around 17 million is a very significant cost decrease just by utilizing existing licenses. And then you have some of the smaller levels. So right sizing was not a big one in this one, and the storage discount and dynamic optimization rather small as well. But in total, reducing the total cost from 358 million kroners per year down to 157 million per year, without really going into compromise with the capacity you're buying or the performance of the environment that you're setting up. These are all basically only cost levels that you are utilizing.
We are now at 3:30.
Yes.
And we are almost through.
Yes.
We didn't go through the charge back and show back. We have a separate article on that in quarterly. Thank you for sticking on here, and we'll be happy to talk to you later. So get in touch with us if you need some of this to be drilled, if you need a drill down in any of these areas. But thank you for being with us, and hope to see you soon.
Yeah, thank you.